Hello, this is ELDERBORN, a game that just recently released after a apparently fairly long but successful run in early access, although to be honest I hadn't actually heard about it until it released. I had no idea that it existed until now, but now that I do know about it, it's definitely time to cover it. So this game promises a sort of small first-person Souls-like experience, and honestly it actually kind of delivers at that fairly well, but to be more honest, what it reminds me of more than any sort of Souls-like game in that sort of wide genre that it is now, it reminds me more of Dark Messiah of Might and Magic than anything else, which is definitely a good thing because very few games remind me of that. It was a pretty special game in its day, and although this is nowhere near as large, as sort of like open RPG as that game was, it's still very reminiscent of that, and I think that we could definitely do with some more games that that hark back to that sort of era of gaming, because there's just not a lot that does that right now. So honestly, I think that if this game sort of mentioned that a little bit more in its marketing materials and in its general description, that would actually get a bit more of a positive outlook, because although Souls-like has become something that a lot of people try, Dark Messiah-like is not. And I think that because of that sort of lack of market there, I think that's the kind of thing that I would want to advertise about my game, that it harks back to something that we don't see very often. So this game, as I mentioned, is of course first person, but it also has a very action-y combat system, a very hack and slash, very kinetic, because of course there are lots of physics applied to it. So just like Dark Messiah, you can kick people downstairs and laugh as they fall if you want, and that's actually encouraged pretty often because lots of attacks and weapons and kicks and things can make people fly, and they take a lot of damage when they land. So a very good way to help thin enemy herds is to kick them off of ledges and stuff, which never ceases to be fun, as anyone who's ever played Dark Messiah will know. There are also a couple of boss fights. The game is pretty light on bosses. There are only 2 from what I understand, but they are pretty fun. You're seeing one in the background right now. And they are at least pretty challenging. You know, they're a good, I suppose they do the job that a boss is kind of supposed to in a game like this, which is to give you a test of what you've learned up to that point. You know, parry timings, dodges, attack windows, all that sort of thing. And they do actually test those skills and even have multiple phases, which is pretty cool. Although no health bars. No health bars for normal enemies or for bosses, so you just kind of have to deal with that, which isn't really a problem most of the time because enemies aren't super spongy and combat is fairly lethal in this game. When you get into combat, you will either die very quickly or win quite quickly based on how you perform. There isn't a lot of like protracted long battles or anything. Even battles with lots and lots of enemies in like very open areas where sometimes there are a ton of enemies waiting for you, they don't tend to be long battles as much as they're, you know, very fast, frantic. You either down all of them and feel really good about yourself, or you die horribly and try again, which I honestly like because, you know, like I said, there aren't a lot of games like that. And when it comes to like, you know, fantasy or first person, anything that doesn't use guns, basically, it doesn't always work that way, especially if there are damage numbers and other RPG mechanics going on. Sometimes you get some enemies that are kind of spongy, and although that's not necessarily a problem in certain games, if you're going for a first-person combat system, it's more satisfying to have the combat be very kinetic. And that's definitely the highlight of the game for sure. The combat is fluid, it is highly satisfying, and there are a lot of weapons to try out. I believe there are about 11 weapons, the game store says. And each one has sort of its own rules. Each weapon will have its own light and heavy attacks, its own timings on swings, and parry or block timings. Some weapons can block, some weapons can parry. And I've also noticed that of those weapons, even those rules tend to differ a little bit. Like, for instance, there's a giant hammer that can block, but it can actually block unblockable attacks, somewhat paradoxically. And there are, of the weapons that parry, the parry timings seem to be a little bit different on each one. It's something that you sort of have to learn while you're using them. You know, like the spear, you sort of spin it in front of you, whereas these sickles and also the katars that you see later on, you just sort of raise them in front of you, so it takes like a shorter period of time to actually get that parry window up. So it's something that you've got to learn, which I very much appreciate, because that's sort of part of the point of games like this, of like very melee-focused first-person games, is to make sure that every weapon has its own feel, and that definitely is the case here. To add on to that, each weapon also tends to have its own sort of special passive or some sort of rule that only it can do. Like the hammer, for instance, will send people flying very easily and can also destroy guards. Any sort of enemy that's blocking can actually go through that and sort of break the block, which normally you'd have to kick through if you wanted, so that's nice to have. The spear can actually stab through multiple enemies at once. It is quite a long-range weapon, as you would expect. The sickles here actually do damage through blocks. Not full damage, but some of it goes through blocks, a good portion of it actually. and they're very, very fast. The Katars, which you'll see in a minute, are like one of my favorite weapons that I've found so far. They're really, really fun. They're extremely fast, and they're very precise. They don't have like sweeping attacks. They're very much like a stabbing weapon, so they only hit directly in front of you, and they do more and more damage successively as you hit the same enemy multiple times with them. They'll sort of get faster and do higher damage with every hit as long as you don't switch targets, which is useful, so you can just like stab the crap out of a single enemy and then move on to the next one. They're definitely a very frantic weapon. They're super fast. That boss you saw earlier gives you its greatsword after you kill it, which is kind of like the Northern Regalia from Demon's Souls. It's a really huge, heavy weapon with very wide, slow, sweeping attacks that get stronger the more essence you have. Basically, the closer you are to leveling up, the more damage it does. And there's even a big sort of staff hammer thingy with a skull on the end that does like double damage on headshots. So if you're able to aim the slow like sweeps at enemies' heads, you'll kill them very quickly. So yeah, there's a really good arsenal of weapons in this game, and honestly, a game like this is kind of gonna either survive or not on its variety, because it's a very combat-focused experience. That's what you're doing most of the time. There is exploration, but combat is heavily involved in that pretty much every step of the way, so you will need to have a varied and at least satisfying combat system to actually make a game like this enjoyable. So it's good that it is quite varied, and it definitely is satisfying. There are also, of course, as is just as important as weapon variety, there's a lot of enemy variety, because in a game like this, every enemy is going to have its own rules and its own sort of way that you want to engage them, and that sort of hooks into having a large weapon variety to make it to where each weapon sort of handles each enemy in a different way. It has different specialties. That's, again, the sort of thing that you want in something like this. Very much Dark Messiah, honestly. That's something that game did really, really well. And this game does do that, which is part of where that feel kind of comes from, in my opinion. And yeah, every enemy definitely has its own rules and different ways that you'll want to face them. Some of them are really slow, but are very, very hard to stagger. Some of them are very easy to parry. Some of them have pretty much all unblockable or unparryable attacks, and you gotta be wary of that. There's just a very different feel to each enemy, which is good, and there are lots of them. Now, I did mention essence and leveling up. The part of the whole Souls-like feel that they were going with this game does involve the way the leveling system works. As you kill enemies and also loot objects, chests, destroy containers, stuff like that, you will get essence, which is in the form of these little blue wisps that you'll need to actually collect until you get a certain passive that makes them fly towards you, which I recommend because it's really useful to have in general. And as you gain this essence, you will see that bar below your health gauge fill up, and eventually it will fill completely. That means you can return to a fountain, which acts pretty much like a bonfire, and level up. You can activate a fountain that you go to, which will make you respawn at that particular one anytime you die, and you can also just use a fountain, which will respawn all enemies and put you back to full health. Sounds familiar, I would think. And yeah, the leveling is pretty simple. It's nowhere near as complex as something like Dark Souls, but I don't think it's really going for that. It's very much in a different style, and the leveling involves 3 different stats: a sort of attack damage stat, a speed stat, and a health stat, more or less. And each one you can just put points into to make them better in general, and also they each have 3 different abilities, as you can see there, that you can purchase once you get to a certain threshold in each one. The first threshold will be, I believe it's 5 points, and you can choose one of the 2 little circular symbols, and some of them are actives and some of them are passives, like for instance one that I mentioned that makes all the essence fly towards you, which is passive, or an active, which is like a charging stomp. It allows you to fly forward and do a bunch of damage to something in front of you, which is really, really useful. I recommend getting that one early. It's super handy to mix into pretty much any weapon's attack patterns. And then after you choose one of the 2 that's available to you, the next one will need, I think, 12 points or something like that. Maybe 10. I think it's 10, until you get to choose that one, and then once you unlock both of the individual actives or passives that stat has, the third one will open up and you'll need some more points to get that one. So there is definitely some progression in the game. Leveling up does make a difference. You do feel a difference, and it helps that there are, of course, damage numbers. Even though there are no health gauges, there are still damage numbers, so you can see how much damage you're doing, and you can see how your stat ups affect you and how different weapons affect your damage and stuff like that. So that does help. And it's a simple leveling system, but it serves the purpose of the game, which seems to be more based on the weapons and strategies that you're using than pure numbers, which is fine. I mean, that's a very good way to do like action RPG combat if you don't want to go heavy hardcore into the RPG. Again, like Dark Messiah, it's a lot of it's based on, technique and skill and weapon choice and stuff, rather than just pure stat numbers, which I appreciate. I mean, I love me some hardcore RPGs, but if you don't want to go that route, then there are other ways to do it, especially in like a first-person combat system like this that help make enemies not spongy and help make your progression feel satisfying and rewarding. As you would probably guess, if you are to die, you will go back to whatever fountain you activated last, and all of your essence will drop on the spot where you died, or near it if you fell off a cliff or something, so that you can, you gotta go back and get it, which is, again, very familiar. And you also have, like a lot of Souls-like games go for, some sort of Estus-like recovery system, and this game does have that with a bit of a twist. You can see those 3 little sort of vial symbols below your essence gauge up there. Those are a sort of healing syringe, a medieval fantasy healing syringe. And going to a fountain only refills the first one of those 3 symbols, so that's kind of interesting. You don't get like a full refill every time you actually use a fountain, which is kind of how Estus-like systems usually work. In this case, you only get that first one. The others fill up by just killing enemies. So as you get essence, they will fill up, and you can store up to 3 at once. It doesn't reset the gauge if you go to a fountain, so if you were to, say, have 1 full and 1 half full, and you went to a fountain, it wouldn't really do anything, but if you were to have, say, 1 half full, go to a fountain, it would fill up that first one, and the second one would now be half full. So it basically just restores 1 based on whatever you have, and the rest of them are meant to be, like, in combat, gained through combat rather than through some sort of, like, reset, which is an interesting way to do things, because it's a little bit different, and honestly, if you are going for the whole Souls-like thing in any capacity, then I always respect taking some of those ideas and changing them in some way, because we see a lot of games that just sort of want to do the exact same thing, which is fine and dandy if you can do it right, but it's even better, in my opinion, to see games that want to take one of those commonly used ideas and alter it, even in a small way, just to sort of make it its own. Another Souls-like mechanic, you could say, that you don't really see very often, so I always appreciate seeing it, is it actually uses the rally system from Bloodborne, or basically something pretty much exactly like it. The only other game I can think of that does that is Dead Cells. That's it. I can't think of any other game that actually does it. So if you're not familiar with what that is, whenever you take damage, part of your health gauge that was depleted will sort of be orange underneath the normal health gauge, and it will slowly drain out. And if you're able to attack enemies while that health gauge is still partially there, then you can actually refill some of what you lost. So it's meant to encourage really aggressive gameplay, meant to encourage like high-speed combat, basically instead of like hunkering down behind a shield. It's meant to encourage you to constantly get in there and counterattack very quickly every time you get hit. It worked very well in Bloodborne, and it works well here too. It's obviously not quite as nuanced as a game with like heavy RPG mechanics like that, but it still serves the same purpose, and it encourages very high-speed combat, and of course it encourages you to switch weapons sometimes, because different weapons will fill it up in different speeds, just like how Bloodborne works, although in this case it seems to be based purely on damage, whereas in something like Bloodborne it was based on which weapons made enemies bleed the most. In this case, the hammer is one of the things that fills up the fastest because it does the most like base damage. So yeah, it does encourage some weapon switching and some just general different strategy changes if you get hit, because you'll need to sort of try and retaliate as quickly as possible and dash around the place and stuff, remain mobile to refill some of that health. The other Souls-like mechanic, since the game does describe itself that way, that I would say that this game embodies pretty well is the enemy placement of the Souls games, where enemies are already spawned in the world. There are no like surprise teleport in enemies or anything. Sometimes they're hidden behind walls or something like that, but you can always sort of see them coming, and enemies in general will be standing around in open areas or in corridors or whatever for you to sort of try and plan your attack. And I've always kind of liked that way of doing enemy placement, because it involves, no surprises. It involves you just going around and being aware of your surroundings to sort of help you survive, and this game does embody that actually pretty well. All of the enemies will pretty much always be spawned in already, so you can approach them with whatever weapon you choose and whatever techniques you choose and try to survive that way, instead of having a bunch of encounters that will always have a bunch of surprise spawn and teleporting enemies and stuff. It doesn't really work that way. Even the enemies that can turn invisible and stuff will start visible, so if you're able to see them first, you know what's about to happen, who's about to attack you. So I do like that very much. I would say one of the weaknesses of the game is occasionally the combat has like an odd timing problem, by which I mean getting hit while you're charging an attack causes your character to sort of reel backwards and not actually be able to do anything for a minute. You can't really dodge or attack or parry or do anything while that is happening, and sometimes this animation causes like some input queuing, basically where you'll say click during that and it won't go off at first, and then when the animation ends like a second later, that attack will go off even though you clicked like a full second earlier, and this can lead to some weird sort of feedback loops where you tried to parry but missed, so you clicked to attack, but that was actually processed later than you thought, so the attack misses, so you parry again, and that gets delayed as well, and you can get stuck in this sort of weird feedback loop of like delayed inputs not registering at the correct time, so you have to just sort of dash backwards, let the input queue reset, and then start over. It's not the biggest problem, but it is something that I felt I would mention because, of course, the game is almost entirely combat, and the whole input queuing thing does occasionally cause some weird loops like that where you just kind of need to step back and reset it for a minute and try again, basically. But once you get used to the way the combat works, that's generally not too much of a problem. It's just occasionally when things get really, really hectic, you do see some confusing melees like that sometimes. Overall, though, I think it's a really good effort. It's a really great first-person combat system, and like I said, it harkens back to Dark Messiah of Might and Magic, which nothing ever does, and is always really impressive whenever you see it, because it's just kind of rare. And for a very small indie team to pull something like this off is actually pretty impressive. It's a pretty good game. For its $15 price tag, I would say it's worth it if you enjoy first-person combat, if you like sort of light RPG mechanics, or if you just want to play something like Dark Messiah, because there is very little like it. It's a pretty cool effort, and I always like to see stuff like this, sort of combinations of old and new mechanics, especially from indie studios, small ones that have the ability to actually, take some risks like that. It's a good game. I'd recommend it. The link is, as always, in the description below this video. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.